Welcome to the Moved to Meditate podcast. I'm your host, Addie D. Hilster. This is a place for vibrant discussions about mindfulness, movement practices, and ways to find more balance and presence in daily life. Here you'll find resources to help you progress on your path, as well as insightful conversations with mindful movement, yoga, meditation, and Dharma teachers from a range of traditions. On this podcast, we spotlight embodied approaches to mindfulness and the more contemplative aspects of movement practice. Listen in and connect to a community of like-minded practitioners. Hello there. Thank you for pressing play on this podcast today. My guest today is Andrew Lang, who is a lifelong educator and a gentle, lighthearted facilitator of meaningful inner work. He's the author of a book called Unmasking the Inner Critic, Lessons for Living an Unconstricted Life. We had such a great conversation about exactly what is this inner critic and how it includes everything from negative self-talk to all the kinds of cognitive, emotional, and physical constrictions that ultimately limit us and make us feel less whole. You'll hear about unmasking, recognizing, and working with these inner narratives in a kind, gradual, embodied, and even playful way. Andrew also positions this deep internal work within the context of our lives in society and how unwinding our individual confusion can contribute to changing harmful constructs like racism, meritocracy, patriarchy, and heteronormativity. He draws from many different traditions in his work, but he has more influence from the progressive, mystical Christian teachers than most of my guests do. So it was really great to bring his perspective into the podcast. This is a really rich episode, and despite the seriousness of the topic, we had a lot of fun recording it. So I hope you'll enjoy listening to this conversation and really come away with some ideas that you can put into practice. And hey, if nothing else, you'll get some solid Pacific Northwest coffee recommendations at the end. Before we do head into the interview, I have one announcement. I am super excited to share that the applications open today for the next cohort of the Mindful Movement Teacher Training. It's a 5-month online training that starts in October, and it's designed for those who want to lead accessible movement practices that truly center mindfulness. If you're a meditation teacher, a therapist, a coach, or an educator, or you're playing some kind of a role where you have a hunch that simple mindful movement practices could really benefit the people you're working with, or if you're a yoga teacher and you're just wanting to emphasize a more contemplative side to the movement practices you teach, check out this training. All the info is on my website at movedtomeditate.yoga/MMTT, including the schedule, the content, and the guest teachers. This is the second year we're doing the training, and I would be really delighted to have you apply if it looks like a good fit. So, okay, with all of that, let's settle in, get comfortable, and enjoy this conversation with Andrew Lang. Hello, everybody. Welcome to this new episode of the podcast. So I am here today with a guest, Andrew Lang. He is an educator based in the Pacific Northwest like me, and he's an alumnus of Richard Rohr's Living School for Action and Contemplation. And he's the author of a book called Unmasking the Inner Critic, Lessons for Living an Unconstricted Life. And I took a look at this book and I thought this would be really interesting to share on the podcast. So I'm really excited to have Andrew on today to talk about how we can work with that critical inner voice that I think most of us can certainly relate to. So welcome, Andrew.
Yeah, it's so good to be here. Thank you for having me on.
My pleasure. You know, I do want to hear more about your background, but I think what I want to kind of start with is just addressing what is the inner critic? Because I think a lot of us have heard that term, but I would just love to hear how you describe what is the inner critic.
Yeah. So I'll start with one thing that has been evolving in my understanding of the inner critic, and I'll name that the title of the book was given to me by my publisher, and I sat with it for like 3 weeks because I just kept thinking this doesn't totally settle with my experience of my inner life, because I never labeled what was going on inside me as a critic. And
Oh, interesting.
yeah, and so there was like some dissonance there. And what I've come to realize, and the when I finally told the publisher, yeah, let's go with it, is that the inner critic doesn't only speak with a voice. I think that's a lot of us think about our inner critic, and many of us do experience it as this voice inside our head that has these narratives and tells us these things. But the inner critic also moves through our body sensations,
Mm,
our gut responses when we do something and we all of a sudden feel like, ooh, that doesn't feel right, or ooh, I shouldn't do that. Sometimes there's discernment there, where like sometimes the body is telling you something like,
mm.
ooh, I need to listen to my body's wisdom. And then sometimes it's your body almost channeling this inner critic personality that is trying to keep you constrained and contained. So yeah, so when I think about the inner critic, I think of this part of you that has developed as a protective mechanism, and it's going to speak to you in whatever way it can speak to you, and that's not only with words.
That makes so much sense because, I've heard people talk about the inner critic before and things like negative self talk or like nagging thoughts in your mind. And of course, I've had my share of those. But I don't know if I always related to like this kind of a personality of a critic like lodged in my head that was talking to me, because I realized I think that it comes up for me more in like feelings of pressure or like just sort of like you described, that somatic sense of something being kind of off, or just that
Yeah.
discomfort that I keep just sort of making this gesture and this like sound. It's like
Yeah.
hard for me to verbalize. So like you said, it's not always this like verbal stream of criticism necessarily.
Yeah, and I think when we hear inner critic, we think of this monolithic like character in us.
Yeah.
And the reality is, and this is where like internal family systems has a lot to offer, is that it's not one part of us. There's many different protector parts of us that have
Mm,
developed over time to, in their own way and in their own language, protect us from some perceived threat. And often what that threat is that when we were younger, we learned that something could hurt us.
mhm,
And sometimes that was explicit trauma, a trauma like event. Sometimes it was more prolonged and just our context that we were in. We learned how to please people, for example. But these are lots of different parts of us. So the inner critic is not a monolith. It's almost like this. It's a singular phrase that sums up many, many, many different parts.
it could be a collection of voices or
Yes.
experiences or different coping mechanisms
Yeah.
and things that ultimately we find kind of limit us or distort the ways that we're like seeing what is and what our options might be.
Yeah. Yeah, there's a beautiful quote, and I'm going to butcher it, but it's Parker Palmer, and he
Oh, I
talks
like
about,
Parker Palmer.
he's so good. Okay, this
We
isn't
can
official.
digress on that for a second.
I will digress on this for a second. This isn't official, but I'll say it here. So when I just finished the book and I was emailing some folks, and I sent an email to Parker, and he responded, and
What?
he read the book. He took it on his last year's summer pilgrimage that he goes on, and he read the book, and he responded back to me, and he said, "This is a fine piece of work." And I just remember hearing his voice, or reading it in an email, but hearing his voice and also hearing all the voices of like the elder men in my life, and how fine piece of work is like such a compliment.
That's such
That's
a wonderful thing to hear.
yeah.
I ran
So
across Parker Palmer when I was doing my mindfulness teacher training, because one of our trainers was also an educator and had done a lot of reading of Parker Palmer's. But just really quick before you give us his quote and we come back to that, just for the people who are like, who are they talking about? Just say who Parker Palmer is.
yeah. So Parker Palmer is many different. He's worked in so many different domains, but he was an educator. He's been an activist his whole life. He is a wisdom teacher and an elder in so many ways. He's really informed by his Quaker faith and
Mm,
this. This just giving himself to silence and to listening to what the universe has to say. And he's been a really powerful voice for how do we come back to our whole selves, and how do we take these different parts of ourselves, and especially around job and vocation and work, and
Hmm.
how do we bring them together so that we feel like we're not living a disconnected life. So he's brilliant and wise, so
Right
wise.
up your alley and mine too.
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
So, what was the quote from Parker Palmer you were about to
Yeah.
bring
so
in?
so Parker talks about illusions and disillusionment, and when he talks about disillusionment, he says, there's beauty in the experience of disillusionment because of the word disillusioning. You are
Mm,
shedding an illusion that you had been given, or that you had given yourself to. And so when someone is going through the process of disillusionment, he says, we shouldn't shut that down. We should applaud them.
mm.
We should say, great and wonderful, and I'm so happy you're going through this disillusionment. How can I help you take this process deeper and further? And I think that is, when I think about the inner critic and when I think about my own inner life, so much of the process is learning to see for the first time the illusions that I've been within and unable to notice and put words to. And so that process of inner work as a consistent and constant disillusioning, and not being afraid of that, but thinking about, I get to see the illusions with soft eyes. I get to practice seeing the illusions with soft eyes. And therefore, I get to start practicing seeing myself with soft eyes. And I feel like that's 90% of it.
That's beautiful. I love the way you described that. And I'm really curious about why this topic has been such an important focus for you, and to hear a little of your background, and if there was just like a particular moment or phase of your life where you realized like you needed to really look at this and what was going on with your inner critic.
Mm. So I grew up in a faith tradition, in a faith community. And when I was 18, we were leaving the church that I had grown up in. And we had this big service as kind of a final going away, and all the folks, we'd been there for 10 years, so everyone was sharing stories, and just, it was really this big love fest. And to full disclosure, I had basically chosen baseball over church at this point anyway, in my young life, but these were still my people. This was my
Well,
community.
that's appropriate for a teenage boy, right?
Exactly. um and so we had this beautiful experience, and this one woman stood up, and she started crying as she talked about how important it was to watch my family grow up with her. And I cry whenever anyone cries. It's just like
Oh my god,
my
me too.
my mechanism. It's
Even if it's on TV, it's like, ugh.
yeah. And there's moments. I also have these moments. Another digression. I have also these moments with music, that I'll just be driving and hear this music. So I think I'm just an easy crier, and that's all right.
Yeah,
Um,
nothing wrong with that.
no, and so I'm crying in the sanctuary, and the service ends, and this tall man comes from the other side of the room, and he's 6'3", 6'4". He's really tall. He's one of those guys who had always been to all the leadership things, all the committees, if it was church, he was there, fully institutionalized in the existence of church. And he comes up to me and he puts his hand on my shoulder and he says, "Men don't cry."
Ooh.
And I remember, that's my first real memory of like my body telling me, like, screw that. Like, that's not it. This is wrong.
Mm.
What is the point of any of this? If this is the outcome of 60 years of going to a church, then I'm good.
If the message is just suck it up and don't
Yeah. uh,
don't like be genuine,
yeah.
then if that's what he learned, oh yeah,
So
disillusionment.
disillusionment, exactly. So I had this initial young disillusioning moment um, of the illusion of what I was promised, the space that I was promised where wisdom and eldering happens.
Mm-hmm.
And this is what is actually happening, and
Mm-hmm.
harming me, right? Like his trauma, all the stuff that he had been taught about how men should be, he blew that through my body. And so I had to
Right.
then deal with it. And so I had this big disillusioning moment. Fast forward a bunch of years, I had picked up a couple practices around mindfulness and meditation. So I was leading workshops here and there on meditation, and somewhere in 2017, 2018, somewhere in there, I had gotten engaged, and I was a high school teacher. And so during the day, I was teaching, and my partner was also teaching there. And so we were teaching, and all the chaos of high school education, and we had been merging
Mm-hmm.
schools, and I was our union reps, right? So there's all this stuff. I'm just running. And we had a new principal, and we butted heads almost every day. As the union rep, I felt like it was my job to butt heads with her,
Pretty
to
much. Yeah.
protect, right? To exactly, right? To protect the people. And so work was just brutal. And then I'd go home, and the partnership was beginning to fall apart for
Mm.
many, many different reasons. One being that we probably spent way too much time together, working together and then going home together. Um, and so I was in this like two mountains. I was in between these two mountains of really the unsolvable. I was in a workspace and a contract that every day was a grind, and I didn't have no amount of my meditation was supporting me in that, or supporting me in the ways that I really needed. And then I was
Mm-hmm.
going home walking on eggshells, right? Trying to piece this thing back together that felt like it was out of my control. And there was a disillusioning experience. One night, my partner and I were having an argument, and we're both extremely kind and calm arguers. So we were arguing on this couch, and I got up, and it was like all this frustration and anger that I had experienced within me came bubbling out. And I said, I gotta go. And I hopped on my bike, and I just tore up the avenue, and I just kept going, 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 pushing my legs harder until I made it to this neighborhood. And I'm not a bicyclist, so this wasn't like good looking. I was just, I was just going, um, and I made it to this neighborhood, no lights on, all like total darkness. Had never been on this street before, no idea where I was, and I just remember coming to this stop and breathing, and I felt another disillusioning like pop within me. And what came from that moment was recognizing I was living in an illusion of control. I was
Mm.
living in an illusion of trying to protect, and the saviorism that I had embodied and taken in. And I think part of the illusion that was also popped there, or one of my interpretations as I walked with this in the next couple months, was this is where practice and no amount of talking and sharing the right things means that you are practicing the things that are actually transformative and healing within your life. And so I had to take a big step back. And that disillusioning moment opened me up so much to it's okay to feel what your body feels. There's something in there worth listening to. It's not my job to save the world at all. In fact, there's so many things wrong with attempting to, in the ways that I was. So I think there's the process of disillusioning has come up again and again throughout my life, and every single time it's invited me into this internal posture of openness to, all right, how has my inner critic, or those voices, those different protective parts, how have those parts been putting a veil over my true sense of inherent dignity and my true sense of connectedness within human community, animal community, nature community, everything.
Yeah, and I mean that resonates so much with the word unmasking that's in the title of your book. That
Yeah.
it is like this process of removing the veils and the false masks and the things that keep us from knowing ourselves genuinely and expressing that authentically and contributing in an authentic way in the world, not through the like put on my superhero cape and
Yeah.
save the world, but making more of an authentic contribution.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, the unmasking piece for me is, or where I have given so much gentleness to it, is that unmasking can be terrifying. We wear these
Hmm.
masks for a reason, and for many of us, they work very well for us. And
Hmm.
so the act of unmasking isn't about tearing it off and being fully authentic for the rest of your life. It's about, can I find one area of my life, one moment of today where I can gently take off this mask that I've been wearing for 1 second longer than I did yesterday. And that's it.
Hmm.
And can I give myself to the process of slowly unearthing this dignity within myself and slowly unmasking all these ways that I disconnect from that dignity.
Yeah, and it could be about, knowing how to take off the mask and put it back on when it's appropriate,
Yeah.
like when you're playing a certain role and to know it's just a role,
Yeah. Yeah.
and to be able to kind of see through that because the problem arises when we're identifying with
Yeah.
these, different mechanisms that we've adopted, and we think that's who we are.
Yeah.
That's when it becomes such a problem.
It's the persona personality piece, which is
Hmm.
when we give ourselves to a persona without realizing that our personas are just masks. Your personality is what you are, what you have been enculturated and reinforced to live as in this current moment. That's where I've talked to my current partner about marriage at some point down the road, and one of our constant conversations is we know that, and this is some from my work with older men in workshops as well, but we know that the person that we are talking to today should not be the person that we are partnered with in 40 years. If there has been no change, if there's been no unmasking, shift in personas, personality, like something has gone heinously wrong. Um,
Heinously wrong.
and so there's that gentle lightness to this work that you and I were talking
Yeah.
about before we hit record, which is that we can hold the fact that change and chaos is going to happen lightly, and how can we shift our posture so that we can walk with that chaos and walk with our unmasking process in a soft way.
Yeah, and it makes me think a lot about, from the Buddhist tradition, there's this teaching of not self,
Mm,
right? That like the self that we take ourselves to be is constructed by all of our conditioning about all, everything that we're taking in from our senses, from, people, from the world. And that on some level, it's not entirely real.
yeah,
But, it doesn't mean we're going to get rid of that self or kill the ego. It's like people express that in somewhat violent ways
yeah,
sometimes. But it's just more, of learning to see through that and to operate less automatically from that conditioned self and to, really just hold it more lightly, as you've said, and to kind of just understand what it is
yeah.
and how to use it.
Yeah. There's a so this is a practice that I've been engaging with. I haven't walked anyone else through it yet, but I engage with it in my own inner work. But in internal family systems and some somatic work, there's this phrase called, the listening room. And when you identify a part of yourself that's a protector part, so an inner critic part, if it's a part that feels maybe like it is in danger, right? How do you invite that part of yourself into a listening room? Like literally sitting and just imagining that part, whatever form it takes in your imagination space. Picture that part in a room, and then picture yourself sitting with that part and simply being there to listen. And for the first day you do it, I'll share for me. The first day I did it with a very specific part, there was no question I had. I just sitting in that space was scary enough with that part that's
Hmm.
in there. And then the next day I did it again and a question came. And the next day, so there's this comfort that's built. And I think that's so much of, it's a shame. It's so sad that we have so much violent language around
Hmm.
uh, around our own inner life. Violent language in general, but violent
Hmm.
language around like, what do we need? We need to destroy, eradicate this inner critic. No, we need
I'm
it
battling with my demons,
battle,
or yeah,
exactly, battling
all
with
this
demons.
stuff.
Oh, that's such a good one. Yeah. And
Yeah.
when really it's, how do you invite that part of yourself into a listening room? Because if you, just like a small kid, right? My small little 3-year-old, when when he's really upset, the best thing I can do is sit down with him and listen to why he's upset, and just giving him that space often calms him down. And I think it's the
Hmm.
same thing with so many of our protector parts and so many of these
Hmm.
different components of us is, how do you build an internal posture that allows you to listen to that part, because that's what strips its power away.
To be seen and heard with empathy.
Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah. What are some of the common illusions associated with the inner critic? Like you did a chapter for several different, ones of these in the book, which is so useful. So I'm wondering if you can give us some examples of these stories we tell,
Yeah.
not just me,
Yeah.
we all do. Was that a slip? I don't know. Like example of like, I am not enough, or, some
Yeah.
of the others. Can you describe a few?
I will yeah, so I'll start with the one that's true and near and dear to my entire existence. The one narrative that is really like a thread through my life is this constricting narrative of I'm not good enough. And
Hmm.
I'll go back and forth between saying narrative and constriction. One of my big pieces in the book is that these narratives, if we treat them just as cognitive narratives, it it removes the impact of our body from it. And the
Hmm.
reality is, each of these constricting narratives constrict us. They constrict in muscles in our body. So for me,
Hmm.
control, right? My back shoulder muscles, whenever they're tight, all I have to do is ask myself, "What are you trying to control?" And it's my body telling me something. So they constrict us socially, spiritually, emotionally. So one of the constrictions is I'm not good enough. And I'll share one of my stories. This went on for many, many years, but I have a long history of having these big ideas. I'm going to build this business. I'm going to do this thing. Whatever it was. And I would sit down with a whiteboard, and this is also the former teacher in me. I've got a lot of whiteboards. My partner has like banished them to underneath the bed unless I actively need one. And so I usually pull out a whiteboard and I'll whiteboard the entire idea, and it's all going to be in front of me. And then this part of me will say, oh, not good enough. Not good enough. This isn't good enough. You're not good enough. There's no way this could happen. And what for years happened was I would hear that. And usually it wasn't a voice. So really, I think more honestly, I would feel that,
Hmm.
that critique. And
That
then
feeling of doubt.
that feeling of doubt and shame. And there was shame in that,
Mm.
doubt that could I do this? And then the shame would creep in around, and how dare you even think about it?
Yeah,
I
who do
mean,
you think
who do
you
you
are
think you
coming
are?
up with this?
Exactly, exactly. And that's where, this is a side note, but that's why inner work can't be isolated work, because a lot of those other pieces come from outside us, right? Like, where
Hmm.
did that shame come from? That came from culture. That came from
Hmm.
the what I was taught about the right way to fit into a box. Um,
Hmm.
and so what I would do is I'd feel that feeling in me, that doubt, that shame, that all that, and I'd erase the whiteboard and put it away and add another skeleton, right? Add another idea that was never turned into anything. And that was part of the process of writing this book. I'll say is a lot of that came out of my inner work of saying the outcome doesn't matter. The It's all process. I'm going to see this from beginning to end. I don't care if I end up self-publishing, going through a traditional publisher. That's not the part that matters. The part that matters is that I'm
Hmm.
listening to this part of myself that says you're not good enough. And in this listening room, I'm building capacity to be able to sit with that part of me and say, well, let's just see, right? Let's see. And guess what? You're probably not going to be destroyed, because that's the other part is our inner critic, our protector. They're trying to protect. And so being
Hmm.
able to gently do something and say, maybe, just a little bit more, just do this process a little bit more. You won't be destroyed. It's going to be okay.
Yeah, those voices
Yeah.
can make the stakes feel really high.
Yeah.
And the only way to poke holes in that is just to take the next step and test that. Is that really true? Is that really true?
Yeah. Yeah.
So that's beautiful to hear you describe like how writing your book became
Yeah.
not only this offering about these teachings, but like the living practice of it, because you were really working through one of those limiting beliefs as you wrote.
Yeah. It was very much a practice. And another one that I have in there is I'm not lovable. And
Hmm.
that's very real. And I'll name most of these came from either hearing them explicitly from folks in my workshops, or they came from my own experience. This is definitely a
Hmm.
constriction I work with. Um, but the I'm not lovable. I have a couple of friends who over time, one of them I share her story in the book, and it's that she was a partner to someone, and every day she would ask, do you even love me? Do you even love? And it was partially kidding, right? It was this little
This cute thing she would do.
exactly, yeah. And yet, over time, the intimacy of our relationship as friends came to be that I learned, where that comes from in her is that she had essentially a emotionally, socially, intimacy wise absent father. And so she was searching for not just a partner, but people. She was searching for, where does my intimacy with others come from? Where does this lovability come from? Can someone please confirm again and again that I
Mm.
am lovable, that someone, right? And, and one of the brilliant things that have come to me in my readings of therapists and poets and spiritual teachers is, in almost every spiritual tradition, there's this thread that love isn't just something you give and take. It's not a transaction. It's not this object, right, that you can buy and sell like it's on a marketplace. Love is the grounding and the foundation of so much of our existence. And so Jim Finley, who was a teacher of mine down at the Living School, he talked about love as a thread through the universe, and all we do all day is we're little birds, and we land on the thread, we jump off the thread, we go other ways, we flitter back down onto the thread, and that so much of the inner work and the work in our lives in general is how do we maintain contact with that thread a little bit more today, a little bit more tomorrow. And that's informed so much of I use the phrase inherent dignity a lot, is that we each have inherent dignity. How do we maintain contact and awareness of that inherent dignity a little bit more today, a little bit more tomorrow?
I love that. I think that's so beautiful to sort of begin to look to the broader universe or experience of life, in this more spiritual or mystical way,
Mm,
as a way of becoming an antidote, really, to some of these um, beliefs that we have. And I think you kind of had a similar practice in the chapter of that was about I am alone, the belief I am alone, that had to do with, communing with nature
yeah.
and like looking at how we're part of this web of nature and how could we possibly be alone.
Yeah. Yeah, there's this beautiful when I think it was 2014 when Cosmos came out with Neil deGrasse Tyson, the reboot of Carl Sagan's
Oh
uh,
yeah, yeah,
Cosmos.
yeah.
And Neil deGrasse Tyson has this beautiful moment when he talks about the spiritual connectedness of everything. We are all stardust. We've all got this stuff in us. We all come evolutionarily from very similar and the same atoms and molecules, and I think at an atomic level, if we want to go down that low, that is a beautiful scientific truth of connectedness. How could we ever be alone in a universe where we are all siblings? Um, and yet,
Hmm.
capitalism and meritocracy and white supremacy and patriarchy and heteronormativity, all of these cultural systems and have worked together to separate us
Hmm.
from that connectedness. So I think so much of this is almost like my dad used to always ask this question of, do you know who you are? And I think that's a great question for everybody, because I think if most of us are honest, we're like, kinda. I kind of do today. I don't know. But a question that has come to me within that is, do you know where you are? And I think
Mm.
where I take that is that I don't want to lose touch with the reality that I am me and I am unique in whatever ways that I am. And also, I am placed within a context and a lineage and a beautiful ecosystem of amazing mystics and poets and people I've never heard of and folks that you've never heard of and plants and trees and rocks and stars exploding millions of light years away, right? Like, I'm within a context of teachers and all of those things. Belden Lane talks about he lives for 25 years. He's an older guy. For 25 years, he has lived next to this beautiful large tree, and it was just across the street from his house. And I can't remember the particulars, but maybe it was his wife dying. But there was some catastrophe in his life. and it shook him to his core. And he walked across the street because at the same time there was a lightning strike in the park, and it had struck this big tree. And he saw this connectedness of, you are this tree that's been growing for so long, and you are now dealing with this catastrophe. And here I am, having lived a life that I've lived, and I'm now dealing with this catastrophe. And since then, for 25 years, he's gone to this tree and sat with it, walked with it, just observed it. And he calls it grandfather. And there's this beautiful, that seems like out of the box for a lot of us. But there's this beautiful recognition in it that I can learn from you, because even this tree is living a life of surviving in the midst of a chaotic world. So I
Mhm.
think that I'm alone, I'm not lovable, I'm not good enough. All of that is our own inner stuff that we can work with. And it's within a context of a broader community that we're never actually separated from.
And that's part of the medicine, to
Yeah.
begin to open back up to that and get out of our head a little bit, so that we can let those inner narratives become challenged and questioned a little bit. And I noticed, that you work with these all these narratives and constrictions in a variety of ways, and using reflection prompts and journaling, and taking these thoughts for a walk,
Yeah.
or doing other embodied practices. One that stuck out to me was in the I Am Not Enough chapter, and it was called the right sizing practice. Can you describe that one for us a little bit? I thought that was really interesting, just talking about this embodied right sizing practice.
Yeah, of course. This is actually one of my favorite practices. I lead this with almost every workshop I do, in some capacity. And so what the practice is you stand, or you can do it sitting too, but you stand with your legs about shoulder's length width apart, and you kind of find this equilibrium of you just standing as straight as you're able to do. And you take some breaths. And then you slowly expand your arms up and out as far as is comfortable. So you want to get like a decent stretch or light stretch, but no pain, absolutely no pain. And you go until you are like fully expanded. You widen your hips, you widen your legs, just full extension in all directions. And you just experience what it feels like to be fully expansive in your body. And then you slowly constrict yourself down, 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 down until your arms are hugging yourself, your legs have bent at the knees, you're as low as you can go, and you breathe for a little bit. And you experience, what does it feel like in my body to be fully constricted? And you go through that movement several times. And there's two parts of why I think that practice is so powerful. One is that we have been taught, some of us have been taught to make ourselves smaller and to not take up the space that we deserve as people with inherent dignity in a universe that we live in. And then some of us have been taught to take up way too much space. And
Mhm.
and so this is a practice of putting into a physical embodiment, finding the embodied space that feels comfortable for you, and to become gently at peace with this beautiful organism of your body. The second part of it that I think is really powerful is that unless you have given yourself to a yoga practice, or unless you've given yourself to going to many, I think there's many different examples of this, Tai Chi, all these different practices
Mhm.
that really honor the body in the engagement of them. Um, there are very few spaces in our world where you can just be with your body and play with your body a little bit. And so I think this
Mhm.
is a permission giving exercise. I'll go back to what you and I talked about earlier, but around violent language. How many of us have gone to a gym and looked around and realized that people are really just brutalizing their own bodies? Right?
Totally.
You're lifting, you're doing it as, this is, I'm going to get stronger, but the energy and the internal posture of it is, I'm going to dominate my own body. I'm going to beat it
Mhm.
into submission.
I'm gonna make it look like I wanted to,
Yeah.
or
Yeah.
yeah, perform how I want it to.
Perform. It's perform.
Mhm.
I'm gonna make it perform how I want it to. And that's a self colonization of our
Yeah.
body. Right. And so
It's a good way of putting it.
yeah, yeah.
Yeah.
So I wonder a lot about, and that practice is an example, but there's beauty in just relearning how to play as an
Mm-hmm.
organism. I have a really good friend who's a poet here in Tacoma, and he took me out a couple years ago to our local park, Point Defiance. And
I've been there.
it's so beautiful.
It's so cool. It's so
It's
nice.
so great.
And it has a cool name.
It has a cool name, and the trees are just one thing that he said to me a couple years ago that stuck with me is, and it reminds me of like Central Park in New York, in that
Mm-hmm.
not someone, generations of people have seen some beauty here that is worth preserving in the
Mm.
midst of a city. That's a beautiful, talk about
That's an
legacy.
amazing thing.
Yeah, it's an amazing thing. Anyway, so we're out at Point Defiance, and we're walking along this little path, and all of a sudden he takes a hard left turn and just like disappears over a cliff. And I'm like, what? and and what he was inviting me into is, he called it a ramble. It's really a wander through nature plus climbing. And at Point Defiance, there's a cliff that goes down to the beach. And so we climbed down the cliff to the beach using the root structures of the trees that were exposed, as handholds. It wasn't nearly as dangerous as it sounds. Once again, not a bicyclist. I'm learning how to use my body. But we climbed down, and I just remember we got to the beach, and he immediately hopped onto some like beach logs and was just balancing as he walked. And I was like, "What are you doing?" He goes, "I'm playing." And it was so foreign to
He's like,
me.
duh.
Yeah, he said it like, duh. And to me, I was just like, this is a language I don't understand. And it's a
Mm.
language that my body sees and is like, oh, that's good. And yet is really hard for me to give permission to. So I think that's another aspect of the right sizing practices. What are the ways that feel safe enough for you to relearn how to play as a body, and to do that as often as you can?
I really love that. The right sizing practice itself, to practice being big, being
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
small, being in the middle, and figuring out, where to be what size and where to step forward, where to step back. And that's such an art in life.
It
But I
is.
really resonate with what you're saying too about play, because even in like teaching of yoga and mindful movement, we have so much conditioning. I see it all the time, but like people coming in, and it's, sometimes it's on that level of like wanting to make the body be different than it is, in some way. Or other times it's more subtle, and it's just kind of like that need to be told how to do it right.
Yeah.
Like, how do I move right? And yeah, we want to be like mindful of safety, but it's so, you know it's so rare that anyone gets hurt if they're just paying attention and to what they're feeling as they're moving. And there's a lot more room for just using your intuition and just like, I call it noodle around. Like, just noodle around. Like,
Yeah.
do something that no one's ever seen before. And it is so foreign
Yeah.
to a lot of us adults. We are just not used to being given the space to play or noodle or be intuitive or, like, God forbid, not do it right.
Yeah. Yeah. When you do that, I'm curious, like when you do that with a group of folks, what do you usually see when you're like, let's noodle around or whatever? Like, is there just like clear hesitation?
Well, it's interesting. Like, sometimes, people who are used to me, they are like, I know what
Yep.
I want to do. They just start to like get into it. And then people who are newer or who are just like less comfortable with that, a lot of times they just staring at me, like waiting for me to show them. And I'm like, okay, if you're not sure what to do, like, let's do this.
Yeah.
So I'll give them something. But it's interesting, like how people freeze
Yeah.
sometimes when they're just given that space to like make something up
Yeah.
and not have to worry about the outcome of whatever that movement or that gesture would be, that improv,
Yeah.
right?
And I love that there's so much beauty in like, and creating a space. This is something that it comes from asset-based community development, but there's this really beautiful focus on, we don't create spaces to talk about the future. We live the future in the spaces we create. And what that really means is that the way you meet should be the way you want the world to be. And so the
Mm,
folks who are creating space where you are inviting people into using your body in a way that's alive and gentle and freeing, and right, that's a transformational space. I've been in a lot of spaces that have talked about transformation, but are still
Mm-hmm.
extremely hierarchical, patriarchal, right? And everyone's
Mm-hmm.
just kind of sitting facing one direction. Transformation will not happen facing one direction. There's
At a
just
conference table,
at a
probably.
yeah, exactly. Like it's just not going to happen there. And so how are you creating and crafting space, co-creating spaces with folks in a way that invites everyone into a totally new way of being in that moment? And I loved what you just said, is that the thing is, once a person has gotten that permission and has realized like, oh, this is okay, and that protective part of me that says no knows that it's not going to be annihilated, it can come the next time and go right into it, start noodling immediately.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, I think it's so helpful to just be silly
Yeah.
sometimes, or like I'll just get people to do stuff where I'm like, yeah, let's laugh at ourselves doing this. This looks ridiculous, everybody.
Yep.
Because it's just diffusing like that part that's also like, what if everyone's looking at me? What if I look dumb? Like, oh no.
Yeah, exactly. Exactly. Exactly.
So yeah, I'll be the first one to look dumb. It's okay, let's all just liberate ourselves from that one for a minute.
Yeah. That we all need, for me it's less looking dumb. For me it's the I will say things that have been historically like, especially around, so like I'll talk about sexuality openly with folks, and it's a conversation that I find myself very comfortable with talking about in a way that is not so far, like I usually read the room, but it's like usually not so far that immediately people are going to shut down. you I I work really hard at, let's talk about it in a way that will bring you a little bit more comfortable with this topic being out in the open, because I think that is there's lots of things like that, that
Taboo topics.
right, taboo topics. In I have a course on shadow work, and it's one of the things that I would consider a communal or sometimes a societal shadow, these parts of our experience of being human that have gone unexamined, and the folks in power or historical folks in power don't want talked about. um,
Hmm.
and so I would add lots of other things next to that, but sexuality is one of those where, just like, you know, I'm okay with not looking cool to give you permission to not look cool. I'm okay with talking about sexuality in a way that's open and sex positive and honest, so that another person can maybe share and talk about that for themselves, or not. And maybe they just think about it in a new way, and that unlocks something in them. So I think there's so much value in being able to hold space and bring up from within that space the energy that will allow a person to shift and to move.
And you're really leading from your vulnerability, which
Yeah.
is so different than the paradigm
Yeah.
of, the leader has it all together and they've figured it out and they're the best.
Yeah.
And like,
I find
you know.
there's a oh man, what is it? There's this quote that I've heard like mentioned to me from people, is that you speak from your wounds, not your scars.
Yes.
Or you speak,
Yes. I
sorry,
love
you
that.
speak from your scars, not your wounds.
Not your
There we go.
wounds. Yeah.
Um, I don't know where I land in all of that. I think there's some truth to it, uh, and I think there's lots of nuance. I think there's something beautiful in someone experiencing their woundedness and whatever that wound is, and speaking from what it's like to be in that. And I think there's also a lot that comes from speaking from the scars later, once you've processed a lot of it and healed a
Mm-hmm.
lot of it. Um,
Mm-hmm.
and so I like to play with that in my own stuff too. Is, where am I in this continuum, and how can I just be as honest to me as I can be, um, and how can I feel
Mm-hmm.
good about who I am?
Yeah. That quote to me is helpful. Like, as a teacher, especially at times if I'm going through something, because it's like, I want to acknowledge to people, what's going on, like not try to hide what's going on, but I'm probably not going to like use it in my
Yeah.
teaching until later when I feel that I can speak about it without so much charge, and where it doesn't become like, oh crap, now the students feel like they have to take care of me because I'm not okay.
Yeah, and I think a lot of
Right.
parents have that. I'll say that for me, like I am attempting to be, and this is part of my inner work, is I'm attempting to be very open and honest with my kiddos around like how I feel day in, day out. And also, so I can model that for them, and
Hmm.
also in a way that doesn't them then invite them to try to take care of me consistently.
That
Because
doesn't make them your little therapists.
exactly. And
It's not
it's not
healthy.
healthy, and I've seen the older side of it as a high school teacher, the amount of,
Hmm.
like, family conferences that I would sit in, and I'd realize, "Oh, this kid is protecting their parent right now, their parent's emotions right
Mm.
now. This kid is caretaking." When that parent, in a perfect world, in a more healed way, would be showing up
Hmm.
differently in this moment. So I work really
Yeah.
hard as a parent to be as honest and vulnerable and model the future I
Yeah.
hope the kids can embody.
Yeah. I love that. And, we've touched on a little bit of this as well, but, in your book, you make some really interesting connections between all these inner narratives, we've been talking about, and the outer narratives of the world, the social narratives that are so harmful. And you were talking about this, like, perhaps harmless belief of the tooth fairy,
Oh yeah.
right, that most of us are given, but hopefully we outgrow.
Yeah.
But then you wrote, I'm just going to read this quote because I thought it was really powerful, but you wrote, "Not all illusions we hold are harmless. In fact, most of them are inherently dangerous because they alter the way we perceive reality. Each of us is impacted by the continuation, maintenance, and perpetuation of cultural illusions like meritocracy, racism, patriarchy, and heteronormativity. These illusions shape the realities we exist within and how we interact with the world." And I just appreciated how you positioned this deep inner work within that context of the larger world and how we show up in it. And I wondered if you wanted to say just like a little more about that and why that's so important.
I think it's important because inner work doesn't matter if it doesn't impact the way we show up in our communities. Like I just, for me, there's not a lot of things I will say with absolute certainty. That's one of them. I've seen so many folks do this personal development, self help stuff, and the reality is it's great, it's nice. It can be very, very important and helpful internally, and yet if that isn't shifting the posture of you in the midst of conflict with your spouse, or at the family dinner table, or in this political climate, if that's not emboldening you to be able to show up in ways that our world is crying out for each of us to show up, then I'm not sure the inner work has done much more than Thomas Keating calls practices around inner work that don't lead to transformative healing community. He calls them uh, oh man, what does he call them? Sedatives, high class sedatives. And I
The
and I think it's real. I think
spiritual
it's
bypass.
a spiritual, exactly. It's a spiritual bypass. And so when I talk about the interplay between the inner work and the outer work, uh, I really am pushing on, we are each activists in some capacity. We are each activists because we're all active within our communities in some capacity. Now, the question is, how is the stuff we're doing to understand and explore our inner life, how is that shifting the posture in which we show up at the board meeting or the workplace or wherever we go? And then there's the pieces around like racial and gender supremacy and um, and heteronormativity, where that is, in my shadow work course I refer to those as societal illusions or societal shadows, and they're aspects that have become so ingrained in so many of us, and at the same time taught that we are not supposed to question, do not talk about, right, never face that shadow, it doesn't even
Hmm.
exist, that in order for us to heal and in order for our communities to heal, those shadows have to be exposed. And they're, once again, just like the inner critic, not exposed through annihilation tactics. They're exposed through this gentle unmasking and revealing and the slow work of change that I think evolution shows us this, right? Like evolution and nature models this beautifully, is that change is so often slow. And yet that doesn't mean hands off. Like we
Right.
have to be engaging this intentionally, knowing that it's the beauty of activists from the civil rights movement all the way back. I mean, it's the beauty of activists engaging in long-term struggle is that most activists will tell you this might not be solved in my lifetime. Resmaa Menakem, who's a trauma specialist, says it might take another 400 years to get rid of white supremacy. And he calls it
Mm-hmm.
white body supremacy, especially in the United States, but in the West in general. And there is a beauty in saying that, and even with that, I am going to be working it day in, day out in my body, in the bodies of those around me. So when I place that and contextualize the inner critic work within that, it's for that purpose, is that if you're working with that part of you that says I'm not lovable or I'm alone, how are you then intentionally going into the world around you and connecting with the love nature in your community, noticing when people are not acting with their love nature, right? How are you making sure that you go and experience or practice being open to the experience of connectedness in your world, which I think would include noticing when you're showing up to a group that's all white, going and showing up in a group that's all men, right? Or all women,
Mm-hmm.
right? Like showing up, really taking a look at all these spaces you're in and asking, why is it this way? Um, and if everything is connected, what are the barriers that I am perpetuating, maintaining, creating that are keeping that connectedness limited in this space? Yeah.
Yeah, there's such a connection there because, if we're operating from these mind states of I am not enough or I don't have enough or I need to control things or I'm alone, it's me against the world, very quickly those things begin to ripple out, into the way that we're treating others and the assumptions we're making about others, what we're projecting onto other people.
Yeah.
It feeds into all of our biases and just the ways that we like make and co-create this world together. Ways we
Yeah.
vote, like all of it.
The ways we vote and the way, I'll give an example as a person who's has a white male body. Like when I experience I'm not good enough in the context of white supremacy and the context of a desire for racial justice, and especially as a former teacher, racial equity in classroom settings. When I experience I'm not good enough, what that then turns into is, well, I'm not good enough. Uh, and so when I go into this space and I don't have a solution, because I'm not good enough really wants a solution, and I don't have a solution, then I'm going to exit that space and I'm going to go right back to the cave from which I came. And so the I'm not good enough gives me a pass on
Mm.
engaging, because if I'm not good enough to solve this problem, then I should just leave it to the professionals.
I have no role to
I
play
have I have
whatsoever.
no role to play, and I think
uh,
that internal narrative then melts and mixes with a white body narrative, which is a question of where am I in this racial justice space? How can I show up and listen when I've been really, especially as a white male body, when I have been taught to enter spaces and assume that they are mine to speak into? And so I think there's a lot of these different aspects that all meld together. And so
mhm.
much of it requires us to simply begin to be aware of it and be aware of where it is in our body. Not just the narrative, but like when I go into a space and I'm starting to feel this way, how sweaty am I? like what is my body doing to
Yeah.
protect or to flee, right? Like all these different parts of me.
Yeah, on what level am I freaking out a little bit?
Exactly. And to learn and to listen and to learn that, and then
Yeah.
don't put it on someone else to solve for you, but
Mhm.
notice, if my entire body is telling me to get the hell out of here, um, can is that real? The first question is, am I actually under threat? For me, a way that I do that is I look for windows and doors. Like literally in the
Orienting.
space. I or
Yeah.
exactly some it's orienting. I orient
Mhm.
in the space. Is there an exit for me in this space? Am I actually under threat? Because my body needs
Mhm.
to know. My brain probably knows I'm not, but my body needs to know. Um, so I'll orient in the room. Am I under threat? And then I'll go through it's almost like a reading of my own capacity. do I have the capacity right now to stay in this for a couple more minutes? If I
Mm-hmm.
don't, okay, I'm going to exit the space for a second, maybe, and then I'm going to commit myself to going back in. Right? Like there's a level of um, self-soothing, and this I'll especially for folks with white bodies when we are engaging in spaces of focusing on racial justice. There is a level of capacity building in our own central nervous systems to be
Mm-hmm.
okay with the discomfort of being in a space and staying in a space. And so yeah,
Absolutely.
and so I think that's many different spaces, and just
And it's not different from what you were describing about, getting comfortable gradually, titrating the experience in the listening room with a
yeah,
voice or part of an inner persona. It's the same work of building capacity and expanding our window of tolerance, for different levels of discomfort, whether they're internal and external at the same
yeah,
time.
yeah. Can I offer a practice that I think might be helpful?
I'd love that.
Okay.
Yeah.
So here's a practice that I know I have a worksheet somewhere. So maybe I'll send you a link to the worksheet and you can um,
Oh, that'd be
put it
great.
in
We can
yeah.
link it in the show notes. Yeah.
So it's just around defensiveness. And the practice is that as you go through your day, literally keep a piece of paper on you with a pen. You could also do it in your phone if you really want to, but mark down whenever you start feeling defensive about anything, what
Mm.
is happening. Because what I've often experienced is that defensiveness is the most telltale sign that there is a shadow at work. There's something that
Mm.
wants to continue being unexamined happening. In societal shadow work, it's almost certainly here's an example. Whenever the state of policing is brought up, or prison abolitionism is brought up, you see mass defensiveness from a large group of
Mhm.
people, right?
Mhm.
Black Lives Matter comes up. There's mass defensiveness from a large
Mhm.
group of people. What that defensiveness tells us is that, oh, we're poking a shadow here. There is something that a large group of people do not want to engage with, and which means that there's shadow work to be done. And that's also internal in our communities. When you're go into your workplace and you realize, oh, my coworker's getting really defensive about this idea, mark it down. Or, oh, I'm feeling really defensive. My boss just asked me to do this. Or my one of my very real ones. My boss just asked me, hey, do you have a minute? I immediately am like, oh, yes, of course. Defensiveness immediately. What am I either about to be asked to do or reprimanded for, or something? And so write it down. And
What gets your hackles up,
what gets your
right?
hackles up,
Just
right?
noticing that.
Yeah, and
Yeah.
noticing it. And then I think there's the work around is once you have it down somewhere, written, somewhere that you can see it, you can almost do an audit of it and notice,
Yeah.
are there
What's the
time
pattern?
what's the pattern? Are there time periods? Are there spaces? When we have it all down in front of us, we can see where the patterns are and what time periods and where. And then the next step of that is, how do we then, if we know every day we walk into this one meeting and we get defensive, how do we shift our posture to a posture of openness and allowing ourselves and just being aware of our space and the space we're taking up in that room, and also with others. If we're walking into a rooms consistently where we know there's lots of defensiveness, how can we calm our central nervous system so that we can show up in a non-defensive state and in a space that's going to be more able, right? More capacity for healing energy. And then of course there's also just like our own personal stuff. If you have a thought that pops up, I'm not good enough, and your defensiveness is like, arg, write it down, because that's something to journal on later, take with you for a walk later, do some yoga, right? Like get your body moving around.
That's so useful, to not be afraid of that, but to track it as a little clue,
Yeah.
a little breadcrumb
Yeah.
to follow. Well, we have been talking for a while, and I just wanted to ask you kind of one more thing about just who are some of the influences that have been important for you exploring this terrain? Because it sounds like you've drawn from quite a few different wisdom traditions, as well as from psychology. I'd
Yeah.
just be curious if you want to name a few of your favorite influences.
Yeah. So I think some of my most impactful influences on my own inner work, uh, amazing people like Mirabai Starr. She is absolutely wonderful. She has this book called Wild Mercy that is the most beautiful, almost like a landscape analysis of women mystics and just this
Oh,
deep
cool.
wisdom. I think it's Wild Mercy, living the fierce and tender wisdom of the women mystics. And it's just beautiful. So Mirabai Starr, folks like Richard Rohr, Gabor Mate, the trauma specialist, other trauma specialist Resma Menakem, who I mentioned, um, beautiful poets like Rumi. Rumi has a big place in my heart. Um, Jim Finley is, almost no one knows about James Finley, and it's a shame because James Finley is, he was a monk for 6 years, and then he left the monastery and he became a,
In the Christian
in the,
tradition, or
he was a in the
okay.
Christian tradition. He studied
Hmm.
directly under Thomas Merton,
Okay, yeah.
and so he had just this, this beautiful mentorship there. And when he left the
Hmm.
monastery, I think it was Cistercian, Benedictine, I can't remember, whatever Thomas Martin was. But he left the
Hmm.
monastery and he became a psychotherapist. And so he just came out with a book recently that, it's a lot of what he taught from when we were down at the living school with him. But he's this beautifully wisdomous elder around what is it to touch upon the hurts in our own life. So he's been a huge influence on me. So those are some. There's so many more. The other one, actually, I'll
Yeah.
give one more shout out just because he's a friend, and I think his poetry is some of the most like beautiful. It's the poetry that moves around the ego and just pierces. His name's James A. Pearson, and it's just beautiful poetry that every time feels like it gives me something.
He's not your friend that took you to the beach and taught you to play on the logs, is he?
Exact same friend.
Oh, cool.
That's why
Okay,
that's why I
okay.
feel like I've
Yeah.
leaned on him a lot in this conversation. I feel like I gotta name the
He's
name.
been with us in spirit. That's
Yeah.
that's really cool. Yeah, that's awesome. Um, well, okay, last question, just for fun, since we're both in the
Hmm.
Northwest, and you mentioned coffee several times in your book,
Yep. Always.
coffee cup in hand. Do you have a favorite Northwest coffee? And if you say Folgers, I'm gonna
Oh
be
no,
like, what?
dear Lord.
I'm just kidding. Of
I
course not.
so in the Tacoma area, I have a couple absolute favorites. Manifesto Coffee is both a wonderful little coffee shop, and their coffee that they roast is great. I also love Valhalla Coffee, phenomenal. Also here, local Tacoma. Um,
Fun.
and oh man, is there any more? I'm trying to think of like Seattle ones. Whenever I'm in Portland area, what's the? Oh, I'm blanking on it now. There's a wonderful coffee shop I enjoy going down to.
Oh my God, there's so
I know
many.
there's
I
no
think
hope.
Stumptown is probably the most well
Yeah,
known
I
or one of them.
yep, I like Stumptown. Um,
Yeah.
yeah, I feel like their logo is like a playing card, maybe. I don't
Oh,
know.
I don't know that
I
one.
don't know. Anyway,
There's so many.
there's so many, and the reality is most of my budget goes to coffee. So
And you didn't say
I
Starbucks.
do not. So Starbucks is, I don't have as much hatred for Starbucks as many people do. I will name that
I
Starbucks is
know.
like a backup for me. And
Yeah.
especially with the kids, when we are driving, they will see the Starbucks logo and they'll go, Starbucks. And so we will often go through and get them banana bread. That is their
Okay.
treat of choice.
See, I think maybe people outside of the Northwest don't really know that we think about Starbucks that way because it came from Seattle and it's so
Yeah.
famous. But
Can I share my dirty?
we're more snobbier than that up
We're
here.
much, yeah, please. Please. Can I share my dirty secret when it comes to coffee? Because there is
Yeah.
I love Dunkin' Donuts coffee, and it is. I recognize that it is a disgusting coffee. Like it is.
But it fills a certain sort
Oh
of
my god! There's just something about
thing.
drinking Dunkin' out of an 8-ounce paper cup that is, while you're kind of cold, that is just excellent.
Yeah, that's a different coffee
It's a
experience. It's not
very
the
different.
connoisseur experience, but it's like this visceral
It's
thing.
it's fully embodied.
Yeah, I get it. I think I get
Yeah.
that. Well, that's awesome. I'm glad I asked about that because it's really fun, like getting to know the coffee scene
Yeah.
up here because there's so much.
Yeah.
Well, so tell people where they can find out more about your work, or if you have workshops coming up, or where they might check out your book.
Mhm. Yeah. So you can check me out. My website is andrewglang.com. And every Wednesday, I send out a short little bite sized email called the Wednesday 123, where I share a small teaching, 2 inner work questions,
Hmm.
and some resources. That's probably the best way to get an idea of kind of where I'm coming from and how I can support. And then my book you can pick up on Amazon. You can get it on my website, Unmasking the Inner Critic. And if by any chance you want to do a more kind of deep dive in your own inner work, I'm leading a shadow work course in October of this year, and
Oh,
that's
cool.
all
Is
on my
that going to be
website as well.
online, or is it local?
That'll be all virtual. It'll be over the course of 6 weeks, and I think it's like an hour and a half or 2 hours once a week, and it really guides you through your personal shadow work, communal shadow work, and societal shadow work, and really laying out a framework that this is the teacher in me is practical, useful, accessible. You
It'll
can
be a
get
really
going with.
solid
Yeah,
curriculum because you have the knowledge to construct that, and that is
yeah,
really something that you don't always find that.
yeah. No, I'm excited to host it. It'll be my second time hosting this particular course, and it shadow work I just think is a beautiful framework for a
Hmm.
lot of what we're talking about, both internally and socially.
Sounds amazing. Thank you for sharing all
Yeah,
these resources, and thanks for taking the time to have this great conversation today. I've really enjoyed all that we've covered.
yeah. Thank you. This is wonderful.
My pleasure. So that's today's episode. If you enjoyed this conversation, please share it with a friend, subscribe on YouTube, or leave us a review on Apple Podcasts and help others find it that way. To learn more about my work, the Moved to Meditate class library, courses, or teacher trainings, go to movedtomeditate.yoga. This is Addie D. Hilster. Thanks so much for listening.